Is President Donald Trump planning an unprecedented takeover of the District of Columbia? Or is DC experiencing a crime wave such that militarization of the district is necessary to thwart the ills of unchecked crime? Well, I tell you that the answer is probably somewhere in between. And welcome to another episode of At Least You Heard It Here. I'm your host, Alyse Adamson, and this is the podcast where we put the topic of the day on trial. And today's topic is Donald Trump's recent takeover of the District of Columbia. And I want to tell you that I have a particular insight into this issue, that being crime in DC, because I was a prosecutor at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia for nearly 7.5 years. That's a federal prosecutor, but I want to tell you a little bit about how DC functions. Because DC is not a state, I know we want to be a state. I live in DC. We're not. And so we are, in fact, governed by the federal government. So prosecutors in DC for most adult crime are federal prosecutors, assistant United States attorneys. And that means your federal prosecutors are trying cases as low level as thefts from the Columbia Heights Target, which, I tried. There was one gentleman, I think he had 14 open cases from there. Why was he on the streets? We're going to talk about that in a second, all the way up to homicides. And at least when I was in the office, I'm sure things have changed. When you first start in the office, you have to spend close to 4 years prosecuting this local crime. So I have unique insight into the happenings of the District of Columbia with respect to crime and some of the root causes and some of the effective tools to thwart this crime and some things that have been ineffective because I spent a lot of time there. So let's kind of start at the beginning, where we are right now. Donald Trump, through an executive order, president has been using a lot of executive orders to flex the authority of the chief executive, that being the president, declared an emergency in the District of Columbia and has assumed control over the local police department. And a lot of people are up in arms about this. But what's important to understand, I'm going to explain this legally, DC is different than California. You all recall a few months ago, Donald Trump also declared an emergency in the state of California with protests against ICE raids, sent in the National Guards, and there were a lot of court cases. A lot of people were arguing that the president had exceeded his authority. California is a state. It's a sovereign state. It's governed by a governor, okay? DC is not that. In fact, up until the 1970s, DC was not governed by itself. It was in the 1970s that a law known as the Home Rule Act was passed, and it has allowed the District of Columbia to essentially govern itself through the creation of a mayor, the DC Council, the entire structure of the District of Columbia. And there have been times where DC has been under more federal controls, such as at the height of the crack epidemic. But, for the past couple of decades, DC has been happily governing itself. However, the Home Rule Act does include a provision, Section 740, that allows the president, the federal government, to take control when in a declared emergency. And that control initially is a couple hours, then it goes to 30 days. And after 30 days, the president would then have to seek congressional approval to continue the takeover, as some people would like to call, but the federal governing of the District of Columbia. And that congressional approval, that's the necessary check on the executive power. Remember, we still are a nation of checks and balances, rule of law. Some may say we're moving toward authoritarianism, but right now that's the way it works. And we have not heard the president signal that he believes he can continue the takeover of the District of Columbia after those 30 days. If he does signal he believes that that is the case and that statutorily he's allowed to do that, I think we're going to see a lot of court cases. But as for now, we're talking 30 days, okay? Now, also, why did he do this? Now, is there an emergency? Nothing has changed in the District of Columbia over the past couple of months, okay? What happened is there have been several high-profile crimes, criminal acts, that has gotten the president's attention. A congressional staffer was shot dead by a stray bullet a couple of weeks ago, and a DOJ staffer was beaten bloody. Now, these are just two crimes, and there are a lot of crimes in DC that don't get any attention, but these got the attention of the president, who now has described our city like Gotham. I mean, just listen.
Our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs and homeless people.
So I disagree that DC is some kind of war zone. And in fact, crime statistics indicate that crime is trending down in the district. It is down something like 26% and is now at a 30-year low. That is 100% true. And that's why messaging is so important, because for people who are not paying attention, it may seem like crime is on the increase when in actuality it is decreasing. Now, here is an important caveat here. The counter talking point to this is what I just shared with you all, the crime statistics. Crime is down in the district, 30-year lows. But we really need to unpack that. Crime is down in the district by 26%, but crime hit an all-time high in 2023, a trend starting in 2018 all the way through the pandemic to 2023. There was an increase across the boards, most notably carjackings and homicides. I was prosecuting cases when this uptick started. I saw it with my own eyes. And we talk about a 30-year low. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the mid-90s, right? Where there was a spike after the crack epidemic. So while crime may be decreasing and there is a downward trend, the level of crime in DC is still unacceptably high. In fact, the legal think tank, the Council for Criminal Justice, lays out statistics where per capita, the violent crime is still higher, even with the reductions, than other similarly situated cities and even some cities that are larger than DC. So that means that the talking point about a reduction in crime doesn't take into account that the level of crime and the amount of violent crimes we are seeing are still higher than other cities. Now, does that call for a complete federal takeover? I say, in my experience, absolutely not. And let me explain why. So right now, if you are in DC and you're walking around at night, it looks a little dystopian. I mean, take a look at this video obtained by CNN. These are federal agents roving the streets of some of our most upscale neighborhoods. This show of force is supposed to have a deterrent effect on crime, and it might. I call this shock and awe. This is a very short-term solution where maybe some would-be criminals are going to stay away because they see so much uniformed police and federal police on the streets. However, remember what I just said. This takeover is only 30 days, and it's unclear whether Congress would allow this to continue into the future. Furthermore, this may be a little bit of a deterrent, but what about all the areas that aren't flooded with police? I mean, while there has been an increase of force, these federal agents can't cover every single street corner. In fact, there was another homicide mere blocks away from the shooting of that congressional intern. So, shock and awe, short-term solutions. But what about long-term solutions? Well, okay, let's just say I think the first night of this takeover, there were 23 arrests. I want to see the stats on who was arrested and why. Were they arresting 23 violent criminals? Because that's where we have the problem. Did they arrest 23 shooters, or did they arrest 23 misdemeanor offenses? And a misdemeanor offense, remember I talked to you about that Target, the gentleman who kept stealing? That's a misdemeanor offense. Were these people caught with a possession of an open container of alcohol? Were these people speeding? What were they doing? Were they possessing a firearm? All of those statistics matter because it's the folks who are running around with the guns. It's the folks that are committing acts of violence that are the problem in this city. Okay, so let's just say those 23 folks are actually violent criminals. I doubt that's true, but let's just say that. They still need to go through the court system in the District of Columbia. So while you have federal prosecutors trying all the case, DC does have its own court system. Now, true, these are all federal judges because, again, there are no state courts, but it is completely separate from the federal court system. We talk about the federal district court here in DC. We talk about the federal circuit court for DC. This is separate. We have DC Superior Court and we have DC Court of Appeals, separate system. These folks go into these courts, and these cases have to be good cases. First of all, there needs to be enough evidence that these people committed a crime, and all just an arrest is not enough. Prosecutors need to review what the officers saw to see if there's probable cause to continue with the case, and whether or not prosecutors think they could actually win the case. Because remember, probable cause is for an arrest. You need to be able to prove an offense beyond a reasonable doubt. This is all an analysis that a prosecutor has to do because they can't try a case that they can't prove. So then they have to go and fight this in court. And I'm going to tell you, as somebody who practiced in DC Superior Court, a lot of cases, especially gun possession cases where officers walk up to an individual, engage them in some conversation, pull a gun off of them, there is a lot of litigation around how they are stopped, right? Because individuals have Fourth Amendment rights. You cannot just stop a person for no reason, frisk them, and pull a gun off them. You need reasonable articulable suspicion, something known as RAS, to stop and have a conversation with somebody. And even then, there are guardrails on what you can do when you're having this conversation. You can't just pat somebody down without a reason, right? So sometimes defense attorneys successfully fight those stops, and the court dismisses the case because they suppress the evidence. That means the gun that is recovered. So prosecutors can't try the case. So those cases get dismissed. All right. So now let's assume those 23 cases, there was enough evidence to continue. They were all good stops. Police handled it by the book, no Fourth Amendment violations. Well, then they have to go to trial or they have to plead guilty. Most cases resolve in pleas. They don't go to trial. But let's just say there's a conviction one way or the other. What happens to these individuals? And this is the soapbox that I stand on, because in the District of Columbia, folks get very lenient sentences. And oh my goodness, this is where people are going to come at me and they're going to say, how can you say this? You want to incarcerate Black and brown people? First of all, I have never said that I am some kind of extremely progressive lib. I have said consistently that I am an independent thinker, and all of my conclusions are informed by research, by my own experiences as a prosecutor. I want to say at the outset that I do believe in criminal justice reform. I think the prison system is deplorable. I do think that we over-incarcerate for nonviolent offenses, drug offenses, and there is data that shows that incarceration is not effective in those cases. There's also data that shows that rehabilitation is a more effective tool at preventing crime than incarceration. So I'm going to say all of those things. And I do believe in a data-driven approach. And what does that mean? It means let's look at what the outcomes are for various kinds of punishment. So I agree with all that. But let me be clear. When it comes to violent crime, I am talking about victimizing people. You have taken a gun and you have shot somebody. You have taken a knife and you have stabbed somebody. You have committed an aggravated assault where you have beaten somebody bloody to the point that they are disfigured or passing out. That is a bright line for me. You need to go to jail. And I understand that every defendant, those people charged, are individuals. Everybody has circumstances that have led them to that moment where they commit that violent offense. And there are people, a lot of people, data shows, that after this brush with the system, they never reoffend. And I am so empathetic and compassionate. I really do understand social factors, especially with respect to young people, that lead them to make a bad choice. That being said, at the point that you victimize somebody, that their life is threatened, in my mind, you forfeit the benefit of the doubt, because you have not just committed a crime against that victim, you have committed a crime against the community at large. You have made the community less safe. And we don't have to trust you. You have to gain back our trust. There needs to be meaningful consequences for serious criminal acts, meaningful consequences. And that means, yes, a suspension of your liberty interest. That, to me, is a very effective tool. Save incarceration for the most violent offenses. But let me tell you something about DC. And this is not all DC judges. And again, the DC judges, their hearts are in the right places. First of all, their dockets are completely crazy. They're understaffed. Because DC is what we talked about, federal, all of their judicial appointments have to make it through Congress. And what do we know about Congress? They don't get anything done. They're too busy fighting each other to actually do something to help people. So that is also making DC less safe. I hope Congress is listening here, because as you sit on these appointments, the dockets for your DC court judges are just completely out of control. And I don't want to get too far in the legal weeds here, but when we talk about incarcerating people pending a trial, so before you've been convicted, right? You're innocent before proven guilty. There are time limits on how long you can wait in jail. And if your dockets are overcrowded and you can't get all of the cases done in a timely manner, some people are going to be released on the streets that should not be released on the streets, and it is not the judge's fault. Okay? That is not the judge's problem. We need our courts properly and adequately staffed. But let me tell you what is the judge's problem. Lenient sentences. A lot of these judges are very rehabilitation and reform minded, and that is great. They have great empathy for the individuals that come before them in their courtroom. And I'm going to tell you, as a former prosecutor, it made it easier for me emotionally to be able to try somebody when I knew that those individuals were being viewed as human beings. We also have a very, 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 very elite defense bar. So all of the individuals that are being brought up on charges are well represented, and they have judges that see them as human beings. That is great. However, in my opinion, it has gone too far. I can't tell you how many times I stood up in that courthouse and advocated for jail time for the most serious offenses, and either they got the minimum amount of jail time they possibly can. Again, I'm not going to go in the legal weeds, but there are sentencing guidelines that for anybody 25 and older, judges follow. They're voluntary, but not really. So there are some offenses that do require some period of incarceration, but the judges would sentence them to that shortest period possible and then suspend the rest of the sentence, meaning they don't need to serve the rest of the time of jail. They can serve it in the community. Or if the individual is under 24, before it was 21 and under, now it's 24 and over, a law in DC called the Youth Rehabilitation Act applies. And this is a law that, again, it was created with the best intentions to give youthful offenders an opportunity at a life after a conviction. They can potentially seal or have their case expunged from their records so they don't have to say they are a felon. It gives judges more discretion on how to sentence them. So those sentencing guidelines that I mentioned, they don't really apply in these, we call it the YRA cases. A judge gets to use their discretion. Unfortunately, this law gives judges too much discretion, and what I see as absolutely absurd results. Let me give you an example. A 19-year-old named Javari Peaks shot a man on a Metro bus. Now, I've read about this case. Obviously, I've been out of the U.S. Attorney's Office for many years, so I don't know all of the details, but apparently the victim had been bothering Mr. Peaks on the bus. It seems like Mr. Peaks did not initially want to engage. That is a fact that was taken in consideration by the judge. An argument ensued. Mr. Peaks grabbed a gun he had on him and shot this man in the chest. Thank God that the victim did not die. He lived. So Mr. Peaks ultimately pled guilty to aggravated assault while armed and possession of a firearm during a crime of violence. I'm just going to tell you folks right now, as a former prosecutor, if Mr. Peaks was over the age of 24, jail time mandatory. Had to go to jail for a little bit. Now, again, in DC, probably wouldn't have gone to jail all that long, but he would have gone to jail. Okay. Now, one of the things that Mr. Peaks's counsel argued was that Mr. Peaks was on edge because a cousin of his had been robbed on a bus similar to this. I think maybe the assailants had a weapon, and that's why he was on edge. Folks, a lot of people have been robbed in the District of Columbia. This is what I'm talking about. But do you know what a lot of people don't do? We don't carry unregistered firearms with us, thwarting the law, because he was not in lawful possession of that gun. And we do not shoot people in the chest. His victim was unarmed. I know there's some people are going to say, well, you have a right to defend yourself. Victim was unarmed, okay? Shot him in the chest. Completely outrageous conduct. Not to mention, this was on a Metro bus. So a bullet could have struck a bystander. And in DC, we also recently had a case where a 3-year-old toddler died after a stray bullet hit her while she was sitting in her car seat in a car. It's unacceptable. That is outrageously dangerous conduct. So even though Mr. Peaks was sentenced to probation, he doesn't have to serve any time in jail. He walked out, and the judge wanted to give him another chance. He has certain conditions of his probation. He's got to maintain a job or maintain schooling. I just want to be clear. This is not me railing against Mr. Peaks. there is a really good possibility that he's going to learn from this, do well, and never reoffend. Okay. The problem is that what he did is an extremely violent criminal act and needs to come with consequences. Because even if Mr. Peaks learns his lesson, what does that say to all these other would-be criminals who decide when they feel threatened that they should carry an unregistered firearm with them and solve disputes with violence? It says if you do this and you're a young person, you can get off with probation. The deterrent effect is not there. So this is why I argue putting a few federal officers on the street, that deterrent effect is short-lived, and it's going to be confined geographically to where these folks are roving the streets. The deterrent effect of actually putting people in jail for the most violent offenses, that is going to have more long-term impact and is going to send a strong message to the community at large that that type of behavior is unacceptable, completely unacceptable. And I don't care what anybody thinks. I have had to explain to victims after their ordeal, after their initial victimization, their rehabilitation from the damage that was done, physical harm that was caused from these crimes, and then re-victimization. When they sit in these sentencing, they get to make a victim impact statement. They talk to the judge and talk about how their life has been impacted, only to see their assailant walk out. Do you know how many victims I've had to explain that, unfortunately, this is how it works in DC? As they talk about how they feel like the system failed them, their entire sense of security, personal safety has been impacted. And to not just know that their particular assailant is back on the street with them, but that it could happen to other people. Okay, so come talk to me about this when you've had that personal experience. All right. And let me also tell you this. Crime is on a downward trend in DC, but crime is still prevalent. A close loved one of mine, this is just anecdotal, and I know a lot of people are giving their own anecdotes. So let me just give you just over the past 3 years, okay? 3 years ago, a close loved one of mine was beaten bloody in an attempted robbery, took months of rehabilitation to make sure this person was not permanently disfigured. I've had multiple shootings on my block in Northwest. 2 years ago, I was at a coffee shop with my elementary school child, and a man walked in brandishing a knife. Now, he looked like he was having a mental health crisis, and that's another conversation about how we need more mental health services in the District of Columbia. I mean, now the suggestion is we just take all the unhoused people and throw them somewhere. That is not a long-term root cause solution. More mental health services. But this man followed a customer into the coffee shop and brandished a knife at all of us, scared me to death, didn't know how I was going to get my daughter out of there. Horrific. And then, right, the icing on the cake, this past May, my same elementary school kid was at a citywide elementary school track meet. I want you all to look this up in DC, where a man was murdered in front of the track meet, gunned down by 3 assailants in broad daylight in front of hundreds of school children, traumatizing these hundreds of school children, and just drove away, set the car on fire. I'm unclear whether they caught him, but whether they caught him or not is not the point. It's that they felt comfortable enough to jump out on what seemed I look like a gangland hit. I don't know. Again, this is just all speculation, but this was a targeted attack. They felt comfortable to target this guy and shoot him in front of hundreds of DC students and teachers. That is the attitude that we need to correct for. That is the deterrent. There needs to be real consequences and an understanding that behavior like that is completely unacceptable. And if you get caught from doing things like that, you're going away, especially homicide, you're going away forever. So those are my thoughts as a former federal prosecutor here. I'm sure MPD appreciates the additional resources that they're receiving now through the federal government. Again, I don't think we need federal agents. I think we need more funding. I was never a defund the police. We need to have more intelligent policing, take a data-driven approach at policing, but we need policing. So we need more funding for the Metropolitan Police Department here in the District of Columbia, and we need real sentencing reform. If you live in DC, we need to be advocating for revisions to the Youth Rehabilitation Act. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think youth do deserve a second chance, but we need some guardrails. We should not be letting people who have violently attacked people with firearms walking out with a slap on the wrist. Shouldn't happen. That's my opinion. Of course, I always want to know yours. So go ahead, drop me a comment. I want you to do your own reading on this. Tell me what you think, and let's see